I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but the memory sticks with me, raw and vivid. I was house sitting for a family friend, Julie, who lived in a quiet town on the outskirts of Melbourne. She was off visiting relatives and I had the place to myself, a sprawling, single-story house surrounded by gum trees. It was a simple gig: feed her dog, water the plants and lock up at night. Easy, or so I thought. The first couple of nights were uneventful. My dog, an aging cattle dog named Rusty, was calm. I spent my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. But on the third night, things took a turn. I was in the living room, half watching a crime show, when Rusty started growling low in his throat. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe a possum had scurried across the roof, but then he stood up, his ears pinned back and his growl deepened. "What is it, boy?" I asked, feeling a prickle of unease. He trotted to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard and stared into the darkness, his hackles raised. I grabbed a torch from the kitchen and hesitated before stepping out onto the deck. The backyard was silent, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. I swept the beam of light across the yard. Nothing. "See? Nothing there," I said aloud, more to comfort myself than Rusty. But he didn't relax. Instead, he barked sharply, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the yard where the shadows were darkest. I stepped back inside and locked the door, double-checking the latch. Something felt off. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. An hour later, I decided to call it a night. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight and climbed into bed. Rusty followed, curling up on the floor beside me. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a strange noise, a faint scraping like metal against the glass. My heart jumped and I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone, my heart hammering, and dialed Julie's number. No answer, I cursed under my breath, and switched to the flashlight on my phone, creeping down the hallway. Rusty followed, close behind, his growl low and steady. When I reached the living room, the noise stopped. The sliding door was locked just as I'd left it, but then I saw it, smudges on the glass, fingerprints. My blood ran cold as I realized they were on the inside of the door. Before I could process what was happening, Rusty lunged towards the hallway, barking furiously. I turned just in time to see a shadow dart past the kitchen. Someone was in the house. My flashlight beam trembled as I turned towards the kitchen where I'd seen the shadow. The house was suffocatingly silent now, save for Rusty's growl. Someone was in here with us. I forced myself to move, stepping backwards towards the front door. My phone was still in my hand, but my shaking fingers couldn't manage to dial for help. As I reached for the doorknob, I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw him. A man stood at the end of the hallway, half hidden in shadow. His face was pale and blurred, features smudged, too soft, too wrong. His body was still, but his head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if trying to study me. His eyes were the worst part, wide, black, and shining with something inhuman. My breath hitched as I realized he wasn't standing. He was swaying, almost imperceptibly, like a cobra, ready to strike. Rusty lunged forward, barking wildly, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he raised one finger to his lips, shushing me. His lips curled into a smile that stretched too far. I yanked the door open and bolted, dragging Rusty with me. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air. When the police arrived, I was trembling so hard I could barely get the words out. They swept through the house but found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no man, no explanation. But as they were leaving, one officer hesitated. He glanced at me, his face pale. "Are you sure you didn't touch anything in the hallway?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, why?" He didn't answer. He just motioned for me to follow him back inside. My stomach twisted as I stepped into the hallway where I'd seen the man. The walls were covered in smudges and handprints, long, thin fingers smeared as though they'd been dragged down the surface. But the worst part wasn't the handprints, it was the message scrawled between them, written in something dark and wet. "I like your dog." I left that night and never went back. Julie sold the house a month later. She told me she couldn't sleep there anymore. The new owners didn't last long either. Not even 6 weeks later, the house went back on the market. I don't know what they experienced, but if it was anything like that night, I can't blame them for leaving. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that house, about the smudged handprints, the unnatural sway of the figure, and the message on the wall. I wonder if it's still standing there, hidden among the gum trees, waiting for its next occupants. But what unsettles me the most about this is every now and then, when I'm alone in my own home, I feel it again. That suffocating silence, the prickle of eyes on the back of my neck. And when Rusty, now older and slower, suddenly growls at the empty doorway, I can't help but wonder if I ever really left that house behind, or if something from that night followed me home. I'd always loved visiting my cousin Emily in her old Queenslander house just outside of Brisbane. Its wide verandas and creaky wooden floors had a charm that reminded me of childhood. But after that weekend, I can never think about that house the same way again. Emily had just moved in and was thrilled to show off the place. It's got so much history, she said, leading me through the high-ceilinged rooms. I admired the old fireplaces and stained glass windows, but something about the house felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards groaned underfoot, or how the wind seemed to whistle through the walls, making it sound alive. That first night, Emily and I sat on the veranda, drinking wine and catching up. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak or groan. Normal sounds for a place its age. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. Every now and then, there'd be a faint tapping noise coming from below us. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch or maybe an animal under the house. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Emily laughed it off when I pointed it out. "It's probably a possum or something," she said, pouring another glass of wine. But that night, lying in the guest room, I couldn't shake the sound. The tapping was steady now and closer. I told myself it was nothing, pulling the covers tighter and trying to sleep. The next morning over breakfast, I brought it up again. Emily admitted she'd heard it too. "Honestly, it's probably just the house settling," she said, though she didn't look convinced. We decided to check it out, heading under the house where the crawl space was. The ground was damp and smelled of earth, and the dim light barely penetrated the maze of wooden beams and cobwebs. "See?" Emily said, shining a torch around. "Nothing down here." But as she turned to leave, I noticed something, a pile of what looked like rags stuffed into a far corner. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I crouched closer, the smell growing stronger, and froze. It wasn't rags, it was a makeshift bed, surrounded by discarded food wrappers and a rusted tin can. Someone had been living here. Emily's torchlight wavered as she realized what I was looking at. Her face paled and she whispered, "Let's go." We scrambled back upstairs, locking the door that led to the crawl space behind us. I suggested calling the police immediately, but Emily hesitated. "It's probably just some drifter," she said, trying to sound confident. "They're probably long gone by now." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push her. Instead, we double-checked every window and door in the house before sitting on the couch, trying to shake the unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. I got up and went to Emily's room, whispering her name. She was awake too, her face illuminated by her phone's glow. "You hear it?" she asked. We crept to the living room together, ears straining. The tapping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sound that chilled me to my core. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not outside, inside. We stared at each other, eyes panicked and full of fear. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands shaking. We followed the sound to the back of the house, where the door to the crawl space was slightly ajar. "I locked that," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. We stared at the door, the darkness beyond it yawning like a void. I felt something watching us, a presence so heavy it made my chest tighten. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. We both screamed, spinning around. The fridge door was wide open, its contents scattered across the floor. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. My eyes darted frantically around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner, straining to catch any sign of movement. The air felt thick, pressing in on me, and the faint hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening in the silence. That was it. I grabbed Emily's arm. "We're calling the police." We locked ourselves in the bathroom, dialing with trembling hands. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely speak as I tried to explain. When the police arrived, they searched the house and the crawl space, but no one was there, no sign of forced entry. But when they returned to the crawl space, they found something we hadn't noticed before. There was a tunnel, narrow and crudely dug, leading deeper into the ground, hidden behind the makeshift bed. The officer who came back to speak with us looked shaken. He handed over an evidence bag containing an old, beat-up notebook. Inside were crude drawings and lists scrawled in shaky handwriting. One page had a list of dates. The most recent date was that night. Next to it, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, were the words, "She's perfect." Emily moved out the very next day, but leaving the house didn't mean leaving the terror behind. A week later, she called me, her voice trembling and choked with tears. "I think he's still watching me," she whispered. "Last night, I heard a tapping at my bedroom window, soft like fingernails, and this morning, there was a footprint in the garden bed beneath it, just one, but it wasn't mine." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to reassure her, but deep down I felt it too, that sickening certainty that this wasn't over. Now, every creak of floorboards, every shadow stretching across my walls, makes my heart race. I can't stop thinking about that crawl space, about the notebook, about the tunnel hidden beneath the house. How long had he been there, silently observing us? And worse, what if he isn't done? Somewhere out there, the man from the crawl space is still free, watching, waiting, choosing. Sometimes late at night, I swear, I hear it, the faint, rhythmic tapping. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know. The farm was supposed to be my sanctuary for the weekend. My parents had left for a wedding in town, leaving me to look after the animals and the property. I wasn't worried. It was remote, peaceful, surrounded by miles of dry bushland. Nothing ever happened out here, at least that's what I thought. It was just before dusk when I noticed them. 3 figures stood at the far edge of the paddock near the old gum trees, their silhouettes sharp against the burning red sky. They weren't moving, not even shifting their weight, just standing there, watching. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were neighbors from a distant property or hikers who'd wandered onto our land. But something about their stillness, unnatural, almost predatory, set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my phone to call Dad, but of course there was no signal. Out here, the bars were as fickle as the wind. The sun dipped lower, and the figures were swallowed by the oncoming night. I told myself they were gone, but I couldn't stop pacing, checking the locks on every door and window. The house felt too big, too exposed. Every creak of the old wooden boards made me jump. Then the footsteps started, soft at first, crunching the gravel outside, circling the house. I froze by the window, my breath shallow, ears straining. Then the footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then a light tapping on the kitchen window. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it, but then it came again, harder this time, deliberate and unhurried. My legs felt like lead as I crept towards the kitchen, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The window was empty, reflecting only the dim glow of the interior light. I stood there, holding my breath, when suddenly a face slammed against the glass, pale, expressionless, eyes locked into mine. I screamed, stumbling backwards. The face disappeared, and with it came laughter, low, guttural, and scattered, like they were enjoying the game. Shaking, I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the counter and backed into the living room, heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. I peeked through the curtains and my blood turned to ice. They were back, 3 of them standing just beyond the porch, their faces hidden in the shadows. One raised a hand, slow and deliberate, and waved. Then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I fumbled for my phone, its weak light casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Boots scraped against the wooden porch, followed by a knock on the front door, soft, almost polite. "Let us in," a voice called, sing-song and sickly sweet. I backed away, gripping the knife so tightly my fingers ached. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, rattling the door in its frame. Then came more voices, circling the house. "She's in there," one of them said, almost a whisper. "We can wait," another replied, the words dripping with amusement. I ran to my room, locking the door behind me and shoving my dresser against it. My hands trembled as I crawled into the old chest in the corner, pulling the lid down until only a sliver of air remained. The banging stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. My ears strained, desperate to hear where they were, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then came the sound of shattering glass. They were inside. The footsteps were slow and heavy, echoing throughout the house. They weren't searching, they were savoring it. "She's close," one of them muttered, and I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. The footsteps reached my room. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the dresser scraping across the floor. I clutched the knife in my sweaty hands, barely breathing. They were in the room now, their boots thudding against the floorboards, pausing just feet from the chest. The lid shifted slightly and I squeezed my eyes shut. Then the sound of a car engine shattered the tension, rumbling faintly from the distance. The footsteps then retreated and I heard the front door slam. I stayed in the chest, trembling and choking back sobs until the headlights of my parents' car spilled through the window. When they found me, I was too shaken to explain everything. The police came, but the intruders were gone, leaving no trace except the shattered window and muddy footprints on the porch. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, the local police called my dad back. They'd been investigating a series of break-ins in the next town over, ones that weren't about theft. Instead, they seemed focused on terrorizing whoever was home, women specifically. "Matches a pattern," the officer said. "Group of 3, they break in, mess with their heads, leave before we can catch them." They linked it to a local urban legend, a group of thrill seekers who roamed rural areas looking for victims to toy with. The rumors had started after a woman went missing years ago, only for her body to be found weeks later on a property not far from ours. A week after I left the farm, my dad found something in the shed. Hidden beneath an old tarp were ropes, duct tape, and a hunting knife. On the wall above it, scrawled in ash, were the words, "Next time, no games." I can't shake the feeling that they'll come back someday, not for the farm, but for me.